So thank you to everybody who signed in online for our first of the year, January 2025 BrainTalk Live. Thank you for those of us who have joined us in person. And now I'm always used to a couple, I'm missing some of my familiar faces, but I'm happy that all of you are here. So we're going to start off the year learning a little bit more about what we can do to help caregivers. And how the study of caregiving, it is a science, just like recruiting people for Alzheimer's research is a science. There is a science to caregiving, just as there is to learning about different diseases, diagnosing them and treating them and managing them along the way chronically. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. James Rilling. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Did I? Dr. Rilling is an anthropologist by training. He has studied a lot of brain structure, brain function in primates, but his other thing is studying behavior. And in this instance, we're studying the behavior of caregivers and learning a little bit more about that. So Dr. Rilling has a study that he has been funded. Anyway, they gave him money for it last year, I guess. I don't know whether he's still going to get it with the changes that are going on. But we're going to learn a little bit more about things or tools, whether they're, I say tools, but empathy that's associated with caregiving and how caregiving may affect the persons that we love. Now, I'm a former caregiver. I say former because my mother lived with me for 11 years with Alzheimer's and a mixed dementia. And I think that it's a whole lot easier to be a caregiver for your parent than it is to be for your spouse or a sibling that you haven't lived with for a long, long time. And regardless of what illness your caregiving recipient needs, I'm going to say that as a physician, it's really important for you to understand the disease process that that person is going through so that you can recognize signs and symptoms of advancing disease so that you can better understand and appreciate those behaviors, those symptoms that you don't have any control over, and neither does that person. So when you're dealing with somebody who has Alzheimer's or related dementia, regardless of what the etiology is, the latent stages of that disease process make it such that that person has very little control over their behaviors or their physical functions. And so the caregiver has to step in and manage and do a lot of that. So whatever your disease process is, join a caregiving support group, and regardless of what the organization is, whether it's Parkinson's, cancer, heart disease, or Alzheimer's, join a support group so you can learn more about caregiving, learn more about the sorts of things that you can control in an effort to avoid frustration. So at this time, I'd like Dr. Rilling to come up and talk about his study and what he's trying to teach us from this study. Dr. Rilling.
Okay, great. Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to John Lewis, I already got my workout in for the day, so I'm feeling good about that. And thank you for the opportunity to tell you about this new research project that we've just started. As you already heard, my name is Jim Rilling. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at Emory University. And I'm doing this project together with Dr. Ken Hepburn, who's a professor in the School of Nursing. And the title of the study is The Effect of Cognitive Empathy Training on Dementia Caregivers. So let me just start with a little bit of background. As I'm sure many of you are aware, caring for people living with dementia can be challenging at times, and it can be stressful. And as a result of that, it's associated with a variety of negative mental health outcomes, including depression and anxiety. As I'm sure many of you are also aware, the US population is aging, and there are projected to be approximately 20 million informal family caregivers for people living with dementia by the year 2060. And so because of that, there's a great deal of interest in developing interventions to improve the emotional well-being of caregivers. We believe that increasing cognitive empathy in caregivers is likely to be an effective strategy for protecting caregivers against depression and anxiety. We all know that successful relationships depend upon empathy, but it's important to remember that there's two different types of empathy. So one type of empathy is what we call emotional empathy. And this is our ability to feel what someone else is feeling. This is often very reflexive and automatic, but we need emotional empathy to motivate caregiving. It's what makes us want to take care of somebody else. So for example, when we see this little girl crying, I think most of us automatically and reflexively kind of feel her distress, and we feel that we want to help her. So it provides us with that motivation. But the other important type of empathy is known as cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is the ability to understand at a cognitive level what someone else is thinking or feeling and why. So in order to help this little girl, we have to be able to adopt her perspective, to put ourselves in her shoes in order to understand what she needs. So is she crying because she's tired and she needs a nap? Is she crying because she's hungry and she needs to be fed? Is she crying because she wants to be held? Is she crying because she needs to be changed? It could be any of those things, but in order to actually help her, we have to be able to adopt her perspective to figure out what she needs. Cognitive empathy is also known as perspective taking, or oftentimes it's called theory of mind, or even mentalizing. So caregivers also need empathy, and they need emotional empathy to help motivate compassionate care. There's a suggestion in the literature that there's kind of an optimal level of emotional empathy for caregivers. Of course, if they have too little, they're likely to be apathetic and not sufficiently motivated. But there's actually also some evidence that you can have too much emotional empathy. Sometimes people suffer from what's known as empathic overarousal, where you take on the distress of another person to such an extent that you become very anxious yourself, and that can interfere with your ability to deliver compassionate care. So it's thought that there may be a kind of an optimal level of emotional empathy. In terms of cognitive empathy, we need cognitive empathy to understand what our care recipient needs, and also to understand and properly interpret their behavior. The research that's been done so far shows that cognitive empathy, high levels of cognitive empathy in caregivers, is associated with less subjective stress and depression in dementia caregivers. So it seems that having high cognitive empathy may be protective for caregivers' mental health. And so that's why sort of what motivated us to try to develop an intervention to try to increase cognitive empathy in caregivers. So these are the aims of our new project. The first aim is to establish the effectiveness of cognitive empathy training in improving caregiver emotional well-being and immune function, and in decreasing caregiver inflammation. And the second aim is to investigate the psychological and neurobiological mechanism by which cognitive empathy training is able to do those things. So this is the design of the study that we're just starting. So our aim is to enroll a total of 118 caregiving dyads, so both the caregiver and the care recipient. We start by collecting some baseline data before we start the intervention, and that includes collecting data, a series of questionnaires that are completed online. And then there's a study visit on the Emory University main campus, where participants will provide a blood spot sample that we use to measure levels of inflammation and immune function. And we also do an MRI brain scan to measure brain activity as the caregiver is viewing photographs of their care recipient. So we want to know what the caregiver's brain is doing while they're looking at pictures of their care recipient. After that, we randomize the caregiver to a 10-day at-home cognitive empathy training, or to another condition, which is a nature photography condition. After that 10-day intervention, which I'll explain more about that in a minute, we collect a post-intervention. There's a post-intervention data. So we see how those measures have changed as a result of the intervention. And then we ask to examine kind of the duration of the effects of the intervention. We ask people for 1 day at every 2 weeks to repeat the exercise, to repeat the training exercise for just 1 day every 2 weeks out to a total of 6 months. Then we do a final round of collecting post-intervention data, and then people cross over to the other treatment. So that's the design of the study. You're probably wondering, well, what does the training involve? It's very simple, but we hope effective. So we ask the caregiver to take between 3 and 5 photographs of their care recipient each day for 10 consecutive days. And after they take the photograph, we ask them to immediately write a caption for that photograph based on what they imagine their care recipient is thinking, feeling, or experiencing at that moment in time. This is a mentalization activity. The caregiver is asked to consider what's going on in the mind of the care recipient within the context of the situation, experience, and relationship. So I thought I'd show you just a couple of sample captions. We've done a pilot study already. And so this is one example. So this is a caregiver who's taken a photograph of their care recipient. So you see the care recipient in the photograph, and now this is the caregiver imagining what the care recipient is feeling or thinking or experiencing. And the caregiver writes, quote, "Will I fall if I try to find scissors to open this box? My caregiver tells me to be more independent, but I don't know how to open this box. I really don't remember what I ordered. I'm going to check my bank account to be sure no one took more than they should have for this order." Here's another caption. So again, caregiver reflecting on what their care recipient is experiencing. "I feel frustrated when I can't find what I'm looking for. I don't remember where all these jackets came from. Now I'm mad because they're in my way." These are the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study. So we're trying to recruit caregivers for family members living with dementia. So these are volunteer family caregivers who are at least 50 years old, who live with their care recipient, and who have a Zaret burden score of 19 or higher. That's something that we assess, but we're trying to target the intervention to people who are experiencing some burden so we can see if the intervention is effective. They also should have no plan to move the care recipient to an institutional setting within the next year. Exclusion criteria are, we just have to make it sure it's safe for people to be in the MRI scanner, history of seizure or neurological disorders, alcoholism or any other substance abuse, and psychiatric disorders other than depression or anxiety. So let me just show you, we did a pilot study with 20 caregivers, and I just want to show you some of those results. And this is what, these pilot results are what allowed us to apply for and get funded to do a much larger study, which we're just starting right now. So here's the, just some of the demographics of our pilot study. So on average, the caregivers were 53 years old. You can see most of them were female. There's a pie chart showing you the racial distribution of the sample. And most of them were either children of their care recipient or spouses of their care recipient. So one thing we did is right after the intervention, we asked just an open-ended question. Did you feel like the intervention had any impact on you or your relationship with your care recipient? Yeah.
be a little bit more descriptive about what you mean by intervention and intervention within the context of this study? What do you really mean by that?
It might be more, I should say it's really a training more so than an intervention, but it just means that we're asking people to go home and at home to go through this exercise, which is taking 3 to 5 photographs of their care recipient and then captioning those photographs.
So that's the intervention, taking pictures.
Yeah.
And writing a caption under the picture.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because people aren't going to tell you that, but I'm just looking at the faces. So.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to know what an intervention.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so it's just the intervention is taking the pictures and captioning them. Anyway, so here's what people have told us about the cognitive empathy training. This is a few quotes from a few of our participants. One participant said, "It did start me thinking more about what's going on inside of him and how he's feeling on a day-to-day basis about what he's going through. It took the focus off of me and put it on him a few times a day." Here's another one. "I was paying a lot more attention all the time to her expressions, and I started asking her more questions as to how she was feeling. I was more attentive. I would ask her more questions like, do you need something? Do you need a glass of water? I was more in tune with her and her facial expressions." And finally, "It did help me to be more aware of my mom's feelings and emotions, which I usually take for granted because I'm with her all the time. I do pay attention to her moods, but I was more aware of them. It did help me to realize that sometimes she's more sensitive and I need to consider her emotions more than I do instead of getting upset or frustrated. It helped me to learn to be understanding." So we were quite encouraged by just those qualitative responses. And then in addition, we collected some quantitative data. So this is just showing you the questionnaire data that we collected. And what this graph shows you is that from before to after the training, there was a significant decrease in the self-reported burden that the caregivers experienced. There was also a decrease in the anxiety that they experienced. And there was an increase in, this is perspective taking, which is our measure of cognitive empathy. So they reported an increase in cognitive empathy across the intervention. And then the last thing I wanted to show is just, remember, we're kind of taking pictures of their brain activity while they view photographs of their care recipient. And so we focused this analysis. There are areas of the brain that we know are involved in cognitive empathy or perspective taking or theory of mind. And so we looked at whether the amount of activity in those areas of the brain changed over the course of the intervention. And we found that for 2 of those 3 regions, indeed, there was a pre to post intervention increase in activation after the intervention. So that fits with the idea that we're able to kind of increase people's cognitive empathy. And so we're really, really excited about starting, and we would really love for any of you who feel that you're qualified or you meet the criteria and are interested, we would really love to have you participate. I brought actually a bunch of flyers in my bag over there that I'd like to distribute, but this is a picture of the flyer, and basically it says adult caregivers needed for research study. The total compensation, there's 5 study visits, so it's not trivial, but the compensation is basically $100 per visit. So it totals between $500 and $550. The eligibility criteria that I already went over, those are listed on the left, and kind of what the participants will be doing is listed on the right. Please, if you're interested, really strongly encourage you to email, this is my lab manager, Esther, or call her, or you can scan this QR code, and that'll take you straight to a form that will begin to assess your eligibility for the study. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions that any of you have about the study.
So the picture taking is helping us to learn more about empathy, to be better caregivers. I'll repeat it. The intervention is picture taking,
Yeah.
right? And trying to understand what the person who's receiving care is experiencing, right?
That's right.
And by doing this, we're going to do what? What is the person who's caregiving supposed to be learning? I'm just trying to do a recap for everybody.
So it's kind of, it's like an exercise. We're actually forcing them to adopt the mental perspective of their care recipient. And so, a lot of times we're too busy to take the time to empathize, but if we are, asked to engage in this exercise every day, it kind of forces us to do that. So it's building that capacity for people.
Okay, and being more observational.
So we do, Dr. Rilling, while we address the questions in the room and online, do you mind putting the slide back up so
Sure.
for people to know how to join the study? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, the question that I have is the research and all is very good, but I was just running through my head when in my family, my mother and all of those things would have been very helpful. But if you're not in the study, in the research, how's the word going to get out to the masses that really need it?
Yeah, well, ultimately we do the study. Hopefully we get positive results, and then we publish those results, and hopefully the media takes note of that, and we work with them to try to, alert the general public to our findings.
Or maybe through their doctors, their primary care doctors, or
Right.
neurologists, or
So, I mean,
if the doctors have the information to pass along to the caregivers.
Yeah, that would be another great pathway as well. Thank you.
And someone online asks, how much was the whole study process explained to the patients?
What's the question?
How much
Explaining the process
to the patients?
Oh, I see. Yes, so that's an important question. So they are also, we go through a consent process, and we consent both the caregiver and the care recipient. NIH has rules for how to consent somebody with dementia. And so in some cases we have to, they delegate authority to, it's usually the caregiver, but we do explain everything to the care recipient or the person living with dementia. And, to the extent that they can understand that, we try to go through it with them.
Are caregivers allowed to bring the patient with them if they don't have any help during the day?
Yes, we really encourage you to do that. We will have someone qualified available to stay with your care recipient while you're receiving the MRI scan. We also very happy to provide transportation if people need, an Uber or a Lyft or whatever to get to campus. So we want to make this as easy as possible for people. So yes, by all means.
And when do you hope to have the results of the study available? This is someone online and asks, will you come back and do another webinar to share those results?
Yeah, I would be delighted. I mean, right now I'm very nervous about recruiting the full sample. And I know that's going to take us a long time. And so the timeline that we have, it has us doing this over the course of 3 to 4 years. And so I would imagine it'll be 4 to 5 years before we have definitive results. So
great question from online. Another great question. Will there be research gathered about how self-empathy might be increased within the caregiver by practicing cognitive empathy with their loved one?
Yeah, what a great idea. Had not thought about that, but of course, that would be an excellent byproduct if caregivers were also able to cultivate empathy for themselves. And I really like that idea.
Yeah.
I'd like to give that some more thought.
Yeah.
I appreciate that question.
Online audience, you guys are sending some great questions in person too as well. Are there any considerations for what stage the dementia patient is in? For instance, the level of cognition that patient is in?
Yeah, it's really just about the level of burden that the caregiver is experiencing. So we do, as I said, they have to have a level of burden of 19 or higher on this scale that we use. So we do that screening ourselves, but no restrictions in terms of the care recipient and their level of cognitive impairment.
For the audience, in research, and I think that those of us who study these things, we understand the word, quote, burden. But for somebody who's maybe not in science and not that aware of some of these research terms, when you talk about burden in caregiving, can you kind of describe what that may be and how we may look at that a little differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question, and sometimes people are sort of forced into these roles of being a caregiver kind of unwillingly. It's not something that they signed up for. They might find themselves wishing that they had more freedom to do other things with their life, and they may find this a bit of an obligation. And so I think that's one meaning of the term burden. I think also just the stress that people experience. We know that there are behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia that can be really hard on the caregiver. And those things can make life difficult for people, can make life stressful.
Another question from online. Is there any program for someone who's just completed an extended period of caregiving to their parents due to death? So someone who is just in the season of caregiving.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are. I don't happen to know of any of those offhand, but there's many different programs for caregivers, but I'm sorry, I don't know of one off the top of my head.
And do you accept dyads? This is we have people all over the country tuned in from California, like using a local lab to use the testings.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing that makes this recruitment more difficult for us is we really need people from the local Atlanta area who can come to our scanner on the Emory campus. And so unfortunately, we can't recruit outside the Atlanta area. But yeah, the building where I work, the Department of Psychology, there's an MRI scanner in the basement. And so that's the one that we use for this study.
You're getting an MRI and we're studying caregiving behaviors. What does the MRI, the picture of the brain, have to do with what you're doing? Why would you get an MRI? Why are we doing that?
We wouldn't need to. So the most important thing I think is looking at, how does this impact people's mental health and emotional well-being? But because NIH is interested in kind of the science and the mechanisms underlying these things, we're trying to understand, well, what happens to the brain that makes people more empathic as a result of this training? And so there are regions within the brain that we know are involved in empathy, and we want to see if the training can increase activation in those specific parts of the brain that are involved with empathy.
I'm coming to you in the room, but while I'm Dr. Rilling, we have another great question online. Someone may have missed it, but want to know, with taking the photos, how do you calibrate the perception of the caregiver to verify if they are correct in what they see in regards to empathy?
Right, interesting question. So are they accurate in their assessment of what the care recipient is thinking, feeling, or experiencing? We actually have no way of assessing that. But we think that by encouraging them to adopt the perspective of the care recipient, we're going to help them kind of exercise that capacity. But we really don't have any way of knowing for sure if they're doing that accurately. And that's another great point that I appreciate and would like to think more about.
Okay, how many MRIs are the persons taken, and is it, I'm right here.
Oh, hi, I'm sorry, I couldn't
Like,
find
I'm
you.
right And is it used with dye?
Is it used with what?
Dye.
No, there's no contrast or anything. So there's no IV, nothing is injected. So there's 5 MRI scans. The scans last 30 minutes. And the nice thing about MRI is there's no radiation associated with MRI. I've had, many of us have probably been in the MRI scanner to have our joints examined, and they use that a lot because it's, it's safe and it's, and it gives you beautiful images of anatomy. So that's the technique that we're using. But we don't inject anything. It's completely non-invasive in that regard.
I think this question was just answered, but I'm not quite clear. Who receives the MRI?
Yeah, it's the caregiver. Yeah, so what we do is the caregiver is in the scanner, and we're taking pictures of their brain as we show them photographs of the person they're taking care of. And we want to know what's their brain doing while they're looking at those photographs of their care recipient.
Okay. The same photographs they took?
No, they're different. Yeah, they're different photographs, right?
Other people or them?
It's photographs of their care recipient, and then we contrast that with photographs of other people of a similar demographic that they don't know. So we compare the two.
Okay, audience online, we have one more question in the room.
The photographs that they're taking, are they going to be like actual pictures, or are they going to be on the phone type pictures? I know, but to go back and then recap, like where am I writing my notes? And I've used my phone to take other things.
Multi-purpose, like I'm taking notes, but I'm also.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's going to be an extra burden to try and figure that out.
Yeah, I guess our thinking was that
Because I'm thinking a Polaroid camera, shake it.
Yeah, so well, I'm curious for your feedback on this, but our thinking was that the easiest thing would be for people to take the photograph on their phone and then immediately caption it also on their phone, rather than having to use a separate camera. So that's what we were thinking. And when we bring people in, we kind of walk them through that process so that it's pretty straightforward after they go through it, I think. But if you feel there's a different or better way of doing it, I would love to hear it, if anybody has any ideas.
Dr. Rilling, someone online was curious to know if you or your team are involved with the compassion-based cognitive training.
No, we are not. I'm aware of that, but that's a kind of a different strategy for enhancing empathy. And that would be more of the emotional empathy component that I was talking about earlier, whereas we're focused more on cognitive empathy.
We received so many good questions. We do have a couple of comments. So online, they're saying this is an awesome program and study, very much needed for people who are not living caregivers, and highly recommend that a Zoom application be developed so it can be more widespread. Any additional questions in the room or online? Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Parker.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Rilling. I'm going to ask, this doesn't necessarily have any direct question relation to this caregiver study, but on your bio page, it talked about paternal caregiving. Are there differences between, well, the short answer I'm sure is yes, but what kinds of differences have you seen between male father-like caregivers and females? Is there a difference, and why was that an area of study?
Yeah.
Male caregivers versus female caregivers.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much for asking. That's another area that I do research in. And so, yeah, I'm very interested in the biology of fatherhood, because we know that when children have positively engaged fathers, they tend to have better developmental outcomes on average. And so in terms of the neural systems or the brain systems that are involved in parenting and in mothers and in fathers, currently it looks quite similar. And so the current hypothesis we have is that there's just a globalized parental caregiving system in the brain, and that it's used by both mothers and fathers, and we have some evidence that it's used by grandmothers. And my guess is that it's also used by caregivers for people living with dementia, that there are systems in the brain that are involved in empathy and systems that are involved in motivation to care for others. And those are what we kind of call domain general, that they apply across many different contexts. And so that's what, just in a nutshell, that's kind of what the field is finding right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Rilling. Can we give him a round of applause, please?